So now we switch language to English. And I'm very honored to present to you Dr. Augusto Lopez Claros, who currently serves as the Executive Director of Global Governance Forum, an organization, one of whose goals is to promote research on improved or alternative models of global governance in such areas as peace and security, the environment, economic development, gender equality, and the rule of law. He's an economist who has spent the past 30 years working for international organizations, including most recently at the World Bank, where he was director of the Global Indicators Department, a group of some 100 economists and lawyers working within the bank's research infrastructure. He has lectured at some of the world's leading universities, think tanks, and international organizations on a range of economic development issues, and has written extensively as well, including Equality for Women, Prosperity for All, a book published by St. Martin's Press in 2018, and Global Governance and the Emergence of Global Institutions, published by Cambridge University Press in 2020. By prior agreement, we have decided that Augusto's comments to us today on the subject, A Vision of Democracy for the Next 100 Years, will be delivered as answers to several questions which I will pose. So, let me start at the beginning. Augusto, to get started, can we first define what we mean by democracy? What are its defining characteristics, and how can one characterize a mature and healthy democracy?
Thank you, Nogol. I think that's a very good question to get this discussion started. I very much like a definition put forward by an American philosopher by the name of Robert Hutchins, who said that the two distinguishing characteristics of democracy were equality and justice, and that these two, in fact, were derived from a concept of people, all people, as essentially being rational and being spiritual. Because we have the capacity for rational thought and for justice, then democracy becomes possible as a form of governance. But because we also have an inclination to be unjust, and we see that around us all over the world, then democracy becomes necessary. And of course, the concept of democracy has evolved over the years and the decades. And today, I think that most people would accept the view that in order for a democracy to be characterized as mature, we need to have a number of supporting pillars. We need to have respect for human rights and freedoms as embodied, for instance, in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We need to have separation of powers. We need to have a judiciary that is independent. We need to have respect for the rule of law. We need to have periodic legitimization of governments through free free elections. We need to have accountability and transparency. We need to have consultation and participation on the part of various members of society. We need to have a free press as well, that is able to operate in an environment of, without censorship. And I think that you can see why each of these sort of pillars, are of vital importance, and why, when some of these pillars are missing, then democracy comes under threat, and it is at risk of collapsing. Let me illustrate by making reference to a couple of these pillars, and in particular, I want to talk about accountability and legitimacy. Although, if we weren't constrained by time, we could talk about many of the others as well, and we will cover some ground this morning. The question here fundamentally is, what is political power for? And I think that most people will agree that in mature democracies, the exercise of power has to be guided, to promote human welfare. It has to be ultimately about improving sort of the standard of living and the welfare of the people who are ruled in a democratic regime. What does this mean? It means that all the way from the prime minister to senior officials and bureaucrats in various ministries, all the way to young aspiring civil servants, that they all are supposed to be engaged defending the interests of the people. Not to perceive the exercise of power as a means of personal enrichment, for instance. Not as a way of controlling other people's lives, and because this is somehow feeding into their egos or their sense of self-importance, something that we see very often in authoritarian regimes. And this distinction is absolutely vital, if we're going to understand democracy. Democracy ultimately involves the legitimization of governments through some kind of popular choice. And why is this at the center of democracy? Because we want the elected leaders to be responsive to the needs of society. We want to introduce a measure of accountability in the system. And this is done through this process of legitimization that comes from time to time, every 4 or 5 years, depending on the country. And the idea here is that if you, us, all of us, we don't have a say on who we are ruled by, if our leaders are simply self-appointed, if they choose themselves, without reference to our views as electors, then of course what will happen is that we are not likely to support their policies, their strategies, and their aims. And when this happens, when people feel that their leaders are not legitimate, then it's very easy for the public to sabotage, or if not to sabotage, to simply not support it. And then when this happens, of course, not many things get done. Then governing becomes very, very difficult. So there has to be an element of trust between the leaders on the one hand and the public on the other. My favorite economist, Nogol, I think, mentioned that I'm an economist by training. My favorite economist, Amartya Sen, who I guess must have been here in Stockholm in 1998 across the street receiving his Nobel Prize. He said that governments that operate in an environment of political legitimacy, these governments tend typically to be better able to encourage understandings and beliefs in the population which are actually good for society. And he gives the example of gender equality. He says that mature democracies are much better able to feel people comfortable with the idea that we should have equality of the sexes, that women should have rights, that they should be empowered, and they should be participating in every aspect of our lives. Right? The head of the Baha'i community, Abdul Baha, gave a talk in Paris in 1912, in which he was talking about poverty, and he was using very, very harsh, tough language, and saying poverty, extreme poverty especially, is degrading and demoralizing. And he was lamenting the widespread incidence of poverty all over the world. And one of the things that he said, which I think it connects very, very interestingly with this notion of legitimacy, he said, when we see poverty allowed to reach a condition of starvation, it is a sure sign that somewhere we shall find tyranny. And then to go back to Amartya Sen, many decades later, he echoed the words of Abdul Baha when he observed that, Amartya Sen was a sort of world's leading expert on famines, on hunger. And he said that in all his studies, he had not found any independent country with a democratic form of government and with a relatively free press where there had been famine. The only instances of famine in our entire several hundred years history were in contemporary authoritarian societies, in modern technocratic dictatorships, and in newly independent countries ruled by despotic leaders or by intolerant single parties. Right? So, this is a kind of an interesting insight.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Augusto. So it seems like democracy, or its absence, has very direct implications for human welfare and the stability and resilience of our society.
Yes, this is actually literally true. There's a very famous medical journal, I'm sure you're familiar with it, for those of you who don't know, Nobel is a doctor. The Lancet has done some research, has published some research which establishes that average life expectancy in democratic regimes is actually higher than in authoritarian regimes. And beyond that, they have established that the incidence of certain kinds of non-communicable diseases like heart disease and strokes are actually higher in authoritarian governments than they are in democratic regimes. So democracy actually has very serious implications for your livelihood and for your health.
Very interesting. And yet, one hears more and more about threats to the future of democracy. Now, where is this coming from, and what does this imply for the health of our democracies?
There is a certain view among political scientists that I feel very comfortable with. And it's this notion that democracy is like a living organism. In other words, democracy is not going to die because we assassinate it in an ambush. Democracy is going to die because it withers away. It as a result of apathy, indifference, lack of nourishment. It's like a plant. If you don't pay attention to it, it just dies gradually. It doesn't collapse suddenly. And so it seems to me that COVID-19 has heightened actually some of the risks to the future of democracy. And I want to give you 3 examples, because I think this is a very vital question. In a sense, perhaps it is the heart of this presentation. But, first I want to say a little bit about what I call extremes of wealth and poverty. COVID-19 has actually made worse a problem that was already present in recent decades, leading up to 2019, the year before COVID. And it is that, we have serious income disparities. And there is more and more a sense in many parts of the world that we have an economic system that does not distribute prosperity and the gains of economic growth in a way that is very equitable, that is very even-handed. We have cliches to describe the situation. The rich get richer, and those in the middle class or with lower incomes are further and further behind from the vast wealth which is being created partly as a result of changes in technology and scientific development. As economists, we have known already from research done as far back as the 1980s that when income inequality rises, the probability that established democracies will come under pressure and might even collapse rises as well. In other words, income inequality is a threat to the stability of democracy. And in fact, these studies have actually shown the reverse of this as well, which is basically that when income inequality rises, those regimes that don't have a tradition of democracy, the possibility that democracy will set in is postponed into the future. It's delayed further, right? So inequality and political stability have actually a very direct relationship. In fact, the reasoning is kind of intuitive. When income inequality rises, when people see that their standard of living is kind of stuck while that of others is rising rapidly, this leads to disappointment. And don't be surprised if these people who are disappointed, who feel that the economic system is not working to their advantage, at some point are going to basically vote for opportunists, for demagogues, who come and say, I have the solution to your problem, you vote for me and you'll see, I'll fix it for you. In fact, I'm the only one who can fix it for you. Right? And then when this happens, of course, you will see some of these leaders will get elected. We have many of them around the world, and they have no idea how to solve the problem of inequality. And then this leads to further disappointment on the people who place their hopes in them, and we get into this kind of vicious circle, which ultimately can really destroy democracy. Right? So it's a serious problem. When Abdul Baha was traveling in Europe and in America in 1911, 1912, he gave a talk in Philadelphia in June of that year, in which he was talking about income disparities. And he said that if this problem of widening income disparities is unresolved, it will undermine the very stability of our societies. In other words, it will not just be an economic problem, it will become a social and political problem. And it seems to me that in many places, in many parts of the world, we're already there. Furthermore, in another talk he gave in Cleveland the month before, in May of 1912, he called for a readjustment of the economic order. He said that our economic order is flawed because it coexists with massive poverty and with sort of widening income disparities. And he said that we need to create a system that will have spiritual principles at the foundation of a new global order, and that in this new global order there would be no poverty because we would have a safety net that protected everybody, and in particular we would narrow the gap between the very rich and the very poor. So this is clearly one threat, to the future of democracy. I think corruption also is a great threat, and this is my second. I said I would give you 3 examples. I spent a decade at the World Bank as the director of one of the main research groups within the research infrastructure, and we have learned a great deal about the implications of corruption over the last 30, 40 years. We know that corruption undermines in very important ways the development process. It certainly slows down economic growth. That has already been established since the 1990s. It undermines the ability of the governments to collect revenue. Just think of it. You don't need to be an economist. Think of the intuition. Right? Let's suppose that you are a business head. You have a small company. Right? But at the same time, you believe that the taxes that you pay are actually being stolen by the elites, by the president, the prime minister, the politicians. This happens in many parts of the world. So guess what? You're going to think twice before you abide by the tax laws. You're going to ask yourself, well, should I really pay my taxes? What are the benefits that are going to sort of accrue to society if I do this? Right? And in fact, many business heads and many entrepreneurs basically decide, well, I'll find ways. I have very good accountants, who will help me find ways, to reduce my tax liabilities and so on and so forth, right? And this, of course, means that governments then are not going to have the resources, to, for instance, strengthen the public health system in the middle of a pandemic, right? Why is it that COVID-19 found so many governments all over the world unprepared for the pandemic? It's because we have underinvested in public health. And why have we underinvested in public health? Well, in many parts of the world, because the money is being spent elsewhere, or is being simply stolen, right? So corruption undermines the moral authority of governments. Corrupt governments basically have no moral authority in going to the publics and saying, oh, we're in a crisis, we have to tighten our belts, right? Why should we tighten our belts if the leaders essentially are sort of exporting capital to the world's financial centers, building up huge cushions, so that when they retire, they are billionaires and so on. Corruption literally kills. That's literally true. I mean, studies have been done which show that, when you have corruption, You don't have money for vaccines. You don't have money for nourishing and feeding your children. We have 820 million malnourished people in the world. You know, what does this mean? It means that during the first 3 years of their lives, when their brain was being most rapidly developed, they didn't have access to adequate nutrition, to minerals, to vitamins, and to the kinds of things that are necessary, you know, to essentially ensure that you are not stunted, that you fulfill your potential in some way. And of course, it means that we don't have money, you know, for educating our young people in what is increasingly a more complex global economy, so that they have, you know, the skills and so on that will be necessary to you know, sort of operate and gain employment and so on. And then the third area is basically gender inequality. I think gender inequality is a great threat to democracy. You know, one of the teams within, during the time I spent at the World Bank as director of the Global Indicators Group, one of my teams was working on a very interesting project, which was a kind of a building up a database on all the different forms of discrimination against women embedded in the laws of countries. The Constitution, the Civil Code, family law, the tax code, the labor code. You know, there's half a dozen pieces of legislation in all countries that essentially establish the rules of the game, you know, for economic participation. And we were able to track something like 1,650 different forms of discrimination against women across 90% of the countries in the world. Discriminations that make it more difficult for women to access the labor market, that undermine her property rights, that make it more difficult to open up a business, that make it difficult for her to run for public office. Why do you think that in Nigeria only 3.5% of members of parliament are women? Because if you want to run for office in Nigeria, not only do you have to have a lot of money to pay for the campaign, but you also have to withstand a huge amount of violence against you and opposition and ridicule, because in that particular country, women are simply not given the freedom to run for office. The society as a whole feels very uncomfortable with the notion of the political empowerment of women. And of course, you know, we in this database, we also discovered that you know, many countries do not adequately protect women from domestic violence. So this is kind of a very, very sort of perturbing landscape. And I firmly believe that marginalizing women over the last many centuries has been lethal for human progress. It certainly has undermined our economy and our prosperity. And it has contributed to a more violent world than would otherwise have been the case if women had been present in parliaments and in the corridors of power. You know, our 20th century, perhaps the bloodiest of our centuries in recent history, 2 world wars, famines, you know, our holocausts, and so on. And this is very much, it seems to be linked to the absence of women, you know, from decision making. And for me, it's especially meaningful because I have spent a lot of my professional career, you know, looking at gender issues. It's especially meaningful to be today in this building on the 100th anniversary of the granting of the right to vote to women in Sweden, because surely it was only then that we could speak of a democracy that is whole. But prior to 1921, if half of the population did not have the right to vote, then obviously this was just a kind of a very flawed democracy, right? So today it's a very important occasion, and at the same time, I think that it is symbolically very, very wonderful that this anniversary coincides with the arrival of the first woman prime minister, right? In 100 years, finally. So congratulations to you as a country. You know, Abdu'l-Baha said something that I think is very profound. He said, in Paris again, he said, as long as women are prevented from attaining their highest possibilities, so long will man be unable to achieve the greatest which might be theirs. And to me, this is very profound because it says, yes, when we have oppression, when we have discrimination, yes, the women suffer, of course, and that our history provides plenty of evidence of that. But he's also saying the oppressors, the ones who create the laws that discriminate against women, they also suffer the consequences of this oppression. And that is manifested in their inability to fulfill their own potential. Right? So it's a powerful. And then finally, on this point, Abdul Baha gave a talk in Philadelphia in 1912 as well, in which he established a direct linkage between gender equality on the one hand and the establishment of world peace and security on the other. I find it so interesting. I'll read that quote to you. It's a very powerful statement. But I find it so interesting that it was only 15 years ago that the Security Council of the United Nations finally recognized the role of women on peace and security issues, formally, through a resolution. But in Philadelphia, Abdul Baha said, equality between men and women is conducive to the abolition of warfare for the reason that women will never be willing to sanction it. Mothers will not give their sons as sacrifices upon the battlefield after 20 years of anxiety and loving devotion in rearing them from infancy, no matter what cause they are called upon to defend. There is no doubt that when women obtain equality of rights, war will entirely cease among mankind. That was a long answer.
Thank you very much. I think a lot of us can relate to the threats you described so beautifully and precisely. And I wanted to take the opportunity now to ask, what do you see as the biggest challenges to democracy in the coming decades? What do we need to get right so that our children and grandchildren will partake of its benefits in a context of peace, security, and prosperity, as is also called for by the UN Charter, whose own 75th anniversary we celebrated just last year?
In this debate about the future of democracy, there has been a kind of a tendency to see that debate against the background of sort of rising superpower tensions, between sort of our two global powers, which arguably, are different models of human development. One very much based on the notion of democracy, as I have described it, and one, based on a different conception of political power. And this reminds me a little bit of the debate about democracy in the context of the Cold War, except that in the Cold War we had the United States and its Western allies, and we had the Soviet Union and its particular allies in that part of the world. But that particular debate, has shifted, 30 years later, and now we have, emerging China in East Asia. Now, my angle on this question is a little different, and let me carry you through the reasoning. First of all, today we're facing a whole range of global catastrophic risks, serious problems, that cast a threat over our future. Climate change and its consequences, the renewal of the arms race. Back in the late 80s, early 90s, we thought, with the end of the Cold War, we're going to have a peace dividend, we're going to have resources to spend on human development and so on, but we're back to the arms race today. We have another threat about the possible malignant uses of technology and science, especially in the development of new weapons of mass destruction and so on. We have vulnerability to viruses, which we have seen dramatically in the last couple of years, which itself is a consequence of our particular economic system, which, because of population growth, requires that we build more roads, that we open up lands, that we provide heating in the winter and air conditioning in the summer, and that essentially we make life possible for a couple more billion people, which are going to be born between now and 2050, according to the United Nations. Right? And so this means that we are entering into habitats that traditionally shelter species and animals that carry viruses against which we have no immunity. And so as we go into this relentless march of expansion of our global economy under our current sort of economic model, we come into contact with this risk. So all of these things, addressing these problems will require much stronger international cooperation. Right? So from my perspective, the future of democracy is very much linked to how democratic regimes, Sweden is a good example, how our democratic regimes work together with other democracies and with other, especially large countries that do not share our political values and that have different forms of governance, right? How we work together in order to address these problems and to solve these problems, which are a great threat to our future, right? Because if we don't, if these problems get unresolved, if over the next 10, 20 years, climate change everywhere, in the context of democracies and in the context of authoritarian regimes, is essentially going to bring a huge amount of suffering and disruption, then our political system is going to be under great pressure, and democracy itself will be under threat. Because people are going to say, well, if democracy doesn't solve these problems, then what is it good for? Right? People want results. They want a linkage between the political system that they evolved and the welfare that they perceive. And if our political systems are not going to deliver solutions, in a sense, perhaps ultimately it doesn't matter whether it's democracy or authoritarian, the system will potentially collapse. So my question then is this feasible? Can democracies such as Sweden and others, do this task, work with other democracies and with other regimes to deliver solutions? And here, if you allow me, I'd like to go back to a letter which was written by Abdul Baha to a lady by the name of Jane Elizabeth White in the year 1906. Jane Elizabeth White was the wife of a Scottish clergyman, and she was a great enthusiast of sort of the Baha'i teachings, and she liked this global vision and very tolerant, open faith. And so Abdul Baha wrote to her, and the letter is actually very interesting, and it addresses this issue that you have asked. He said that in previous ages, in long past, the concept of the unity of mankind was not comprehensible. It didn't have any kind of meaning that people could relate to. Because in the context of societies that were not even aware of each other's existence, because of barriers of communication, because of geography, right? If you go back to the 13th century, did people know that there was a continent called Australia here in Europe? Did people know that there were civilizations in the Americas that were ancient and so on? No, of course they didn't, right? And so how could you talk about the unity of mankind when most people were born in their villages and basically spent much of their lifetime within a small radius, from the place where they were born. Right? So it was an alien concept. It made no sense. But then he says in the letter to Elizabeth White, he says, however, in the 20th century, because of sort of new technologies, because we have discovered new forms of communication, because we can travel more easily, because there is international trade, because we see the emergence of an interdependent community of nations, then the concept of the unity of mankind makes sense. It is something whose time has come. And then he says something that has a kind of a flavor of prophecy to it. He says that the 20th century will in the future be remembered as the century of light, because it will be the century in which people finally realize that the unity of mankind is possible, causing, and I quote here, causing all the peoples of the world to regard themselves as citizens of one common fatherland. And I'd just like to add here that, at the tail end of the 20th century, we in fact finally mapped the human genome. And the first insight that came from that particular project was the realization that the concept of race is actually a cultural concept. It is not a concept that has any scientific underpinning. And in fact, Craig Ventier, the head of the American team, said there is only one race, the human race. And so, if we're citizens of one common motherland, then this means that we need to broaden our loyalties, consistent with this vision of our essential kinship. We need to have a sense of solidarity towards the human family, that not just our particular tribe or particular group, whether it's ethnicity, religious group, and so on. Abdu'l-Baha, in 1919, he wrote a very famous letter to an eminent group of jurists that were based in The Hague. And this was the Committee for the Study of a Permanent Peace. They had been set up in 1915 with the aim of basically asking themselves, how do we prevent this calamity, World War I, from ever happening again? And so they had written to Abdu'l-Baha, and Abdu'l-Baha wrote back. Their letter took several years to get to what today is Israel. But when he got it, he not only drafted a response, he actually sent a delegation to deliver the letter by hand, to these eminent people in The Hague. That in itself is an interesting talk, which I will not go into, so don't be worried. But in that letter, he said, God has set up no frontier between France and Germany. And then he condemns all forms of nationalism, and he says that if this vision of patriotism persists, it will be the primary destruction, it will be the primary cause for the destruction of the world. And this was before World War II, right? So, we face unparalleled threats to our future, and none of them can be solved without stronger international cooperation. And so we need to move to a governance system where no one is left behind on account of their nationality, their ethnicity, their social standing, their gender, because we come from the same stock. We're citizens of our one and only home, the planet Earth. So, if our democracies can internalize these insights and use them as the basis for policies, to work across borders, to cooperate internationally on this whole list of global problems which threaten our future, then I am optimistic about democracy. Then I think democracy will evolve into a system of governance that will be universal and that ultimately deliver peace, security, and prosperity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear Augusto, for these very interesting remarks. If it wasn't for the time, I would wanting to ask questions all day long. This was very interesting, and we're very much looking forward to following up these interesting discussions also after the program. Thank you so incredibly much for coming here today and offering these contributions to the program. Thank you.